In the autumn of 1869, a postal rider named Clarence Holt was making his weekly run along the Conestoga Road outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when his horse refused to move. The animal planted all 4 feet in the mud and would not take another step. Holt climbed down from the saddle. He walked 30 yards ahead to see what had stopped the horse. What he found, half wrapped in a wool blanket and lying in the ditch beside the road, was a child, a girl, approximately 2 years of age. She was alive. She was breathing. She had blue eyes and dark hair, and she weighed when she was brought to the Lancaster County poorhouse later that evening and placed on the grain scale kept by the receiving ward exactly 52 pounds. A 2-year-old girl, 52 pounds. The attending physician, a doctor, Franklin Ware, wrote in his intake notes that the child showed no signs of illness, no signs of injury, and no signs of distress. She was proportioned, he wrote, like a child of 2. Her face was the face of a toddler. Her hands were the hands of a toddler. Her teeth had come in at the normal intervals. But her frame, her bones, her height, the breadth of her shoulders, belonged, in Ware's own words, to a child of 7 or 8. He weighed her twice on the same scale. He noted the number both times. 52 pounds. He summoned a second physician to confirm. That physician, whose name appears in Ware's notes as a Dr. H. Clement, examined the child for 20 minutes and signed the intake document without amendment. The official record of Lancaster County for the year 1869 contains no further mention of this child. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what happened on that road in Lancaster County, we have to go back. Not just a few years. We have to go back to a world that the history books have quietly flattened. The 1860s in rural Pennsylvania were not quiet years. The Civil War had just ended. The country was flooded with displacement, with grief, with men returning from battlefields missing limbs and full years of their lives. Orphaned children were moving through public systems that had no capacity to absorb them. County poorhouses were receiving abandoned infants weekly. Record-keeping was inconsistent by any standard we would recognize today. A child could pass through 3 institutions in a single season and leave a paper trail in none of them. This is essential context. It is exactly the kind of context that makes it possible to lose a 52-pound 2-year-old and never be asked to explain where she went. But it is also worth understanding what Lancaster County in 1869 was not. It was not a frontier outpost. It was not an isolated rural backwater with no administrative infrastructure. Lancaster County was one of the most agriculturally productive counties in the entire country. It had functioning courts, functioning newspapers, and functioning medical institutions with trained physicians who maintained professional correspondence with colleagues in Philadelphia and Baltimore. It had the Lancaster Intelligencer, founded in 1799, which covered county affairs with the regularity of a much larger city. It had a county poorhouse that processed dozens of intake cases per month and maintained the kind of administrative records that survive for a reason, because county governments needed them for funding, for accountability, for audit. When something unusual happened in Lancaster County in 1869, there were mechanisms for recording it. And when those mechanisms went silent on a specific case involving a specific child on a specific date, that silence was not an accident of an overwhelmed system. It was a choice someone made. That distinction matters enormously. The absence of a record in an overwhelmed rural outpost means very little. The absence of a record in a functioning administrative county, where 2 physicians signed a document and a journalist later tracked down 2 witnesses who remembered the event clearly 2 decades later. means something else entirely. It means the record was not absent. It was removed, or it was never allowed to propagate beyond the 4 lines that still survive in Weir's ledger. Dr. Franklin Ware was not a man given to exaggeration. He had served as a field surgeon during the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, 6 years before he encountered the child on the Conestoga Road. He had documented thousands of casualties under conditions that would end most men's careers. He had held men down on tables and removed pieces of metal from their bodies without anesthesia, and written about it afterward with clinical precision. His intake notes from the Lancaster County Poorhouse between 1867 and 1874 survive in partial form at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. They are meticulous. Dates, weights, descriptions of ailments, discharge notes. Weir did not use words carelessly. When he wrote 52 pounds and noted a child of approximately 2 years, he knew exactly what he was putting to paper. He had the second physician sign the same document. That is not the behavior of a man who thinks he may have made an error. The Historical Society's catalog lists his intake ledger from 1869. The entry for October 14th of that year, the date corresponding to the arrival of the child Holt brought in, occupies 4 handwritten lines. Those 4 lines are the last time she appears in any record that has been made publicly accessible. A journalist named Gerald Marsh wrote about the case in 1891, 22 years after the fact, in a short article published in the Lancaster Intelligencer. Marsh had spent several months tracking down surviving witnesses. He spoke to 2 former employees of the poorhouse, a woman named Ida Cornwell, who had worked in the receiving ward during the 1860s, and a man named Thomas Becht, who had served as grounds manager for 12 years. Cornwell told Marsh that the child had been placed in the infant ward, and that within 2 weeks of her arrival, 3 representatives from an unnamed institution in Philadelphia had come to collect her. She described them as well-dressed. She described them as carrying documents, though she was not permitted to examine those documents herself. Becht told Marsh he had seen the men arrive in a covered carriage just after dawn on a Tuesday morning. He said the carriage bore no markings he could identify. He said the child was carried out in a wool blanket, possibly the same blanket she had been found in on the road, and placed inside. He said none of the men spoke to any of the poorhouse staff beyond the exchange necessary to take the child. And he said, with the specificity of a man who had puzzled over this detail for 2 decades, that no transfer paperwork was ever filed with Lancaster County after that morning. Marsh's article ran on page 7 of the Intelligencer on March 4th, 1891. It was not a prominent placement. Page 7 of a Lancaster newspaper in 1891 was not a page that officials in Philadelphia would typically monitor. But someone read it. Marsh told his wife in the days after publication that he had received inquiries, not from curious readers, but from men who seemed, in her recollection of his words, to already know the details of the case before asking about it. He had planned a follow-up piece. He told his wife he was expecting a document from a contact in Philadelphia that would allow him to identify the institution that had taken the child. The document never arrived. The follow-up never appeared. Gerald Marsh died on April 19, 1891. He was 53 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure. He had no documented history of heart disease. His wife, in a letter preserved by her granddaughter and later donated to a private collector in Chester County, wrote that her husband had received 2 male visitors at their home in the 10 days before his death. She did not know their names. She wrote that they were not neighbors, not colleagues she recognized. She wrote that after the second visit, her husband sat for a long time in his study without speaking, and then burned several documents in the fireplace. He told her afterward not to speak of the child case to anyone. He said the words, she wrote, as though he was frightened. Gerald Marsh was not a man she had ever seen frightened before. The Intelligencer's archives do not contain any unpublished Marsh manuscripts related to the Lancaster child. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the official history of human development in the 19th century, particularly in the period between 1840 and 1900, is missing chapters that mainstream historians have never been asked to account for. Accounts of children with skeletal frames and body weights that fall entirely outside the documented range of normal development appear in county records across Ohio, Indiana, New York, and Pennsylvania during this period. They appear with a regularity that does not fit the established medical narrative, and they share a single recurring feature. They disappear from official documentation within months of their first appearance. The children are transferred. The physicians who documented them retire early, go silent, or die young. The newspapers that first reported on them do not follow up. This is where the Lancaster case connects to something larger than one road on a Tuesday morning in October. Licking County, Ohio, 1863. A male child of estimated age, 18 months, was admitted to the Newark poorhouse weighing 47 pounds. The intake physician, a Dr. Harold Sutter, filed a formal report with the Ohio State Board of Charities documenting the child's weight and proportions. That report was removed from the board's archives during a records reorganization conducted in 1902. The removal is noted in the board's own index. The report itself is listed as missing. Cayuga County, New York, 1871. A female child, age 2, was found outside the town of Moravia and brought to the county orphan asylum. She weighed, according to the asylum's own published annual report for that year, 49 pounds. The 1871 annual report exists in one surviving copy at the Cornell University Library. The entry for that child occupies a single line. There is no discharge record for her in any of the asylum's subsequent annual reports. No transfer record, no death record. One line in 1871, and then nothing. Jefferson County, Indiana, 1877. A male child, aged 2.5, was brought to a physician named Warren Albright by a farming family who had found him wandering near an irrigation ditch on their land. Albright estimated the child's weight at 55 pounds in a private letter to a colleague in Cincinnati, a letter that survived because it was folded inside a copy of Gray's Anatomy that Albright's daughter donated to the Madison Public Library in 1934. The letter was never published. Albright made no further written mention of this child in any document that has been located. When the colleague in Cincinnati, a doctor, Harlan Cross, received the letter, he had already been documenting similar cases for 5 years. Cross is a thread we will return to in a future investigation. His story is longer than this one, and darker. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. The Smithsonian Institution received at least 3 formal written communications between 1870 and 1885, requesting investigation into anomalous child development cases documented by county physicians. The institution's own correspondence index for that period, which is publicly accessible, contains reference to these communications by date and origin. The responses, if any were sent, do not appear in the index. The incoming letters themselves are cataloged as received, but their physical location within the Smithsonian's collection is listed as unverified. They were received. They were logged. And then they became unfindable. The Smithsonian has never adequately addressed this gap in its own records. It has never explained why the incoming correspondence is indexed, but the physical letters cannot be located. It has never explained why the 3 county physicians who submitted formal cases to the institution, Ware of Lancaster, a Dr. Emilio Caproni of Buffalo, and a Dr. James Pearson of Columbus. All ceased any documented professional correspondence with the Smithsonian within 2 years of submitting their materials. It has never explained why the Pennsylvania State Board of Public Charities, during its reorganization of county poorhouse intake records between 1898 and 1904, reclassified all intake ledgers from the 1860s and 1870s as non-public documents requiring institutional approval to access. That reclassification is still in effect. Ware's ledger, the one containing those 4 lines on October 14, 1869, is accessible to researchers only through a formal petition process. The petition must state a specific academic purpose. It must be approved by a committee that meets 3 times a year. Why would intake records from a county poorhouse in the 1860s require a committee to access? Why would a 40-page intake ledger from a physician who died in 1901 require institutional approval to read? These questions do not go away, because the institutions holding these records decline to answer them. But here is what makes the Lancaster case different from every other account in this pattern. In 1923, a retired schoolteacher named Edna Mast, living in Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania, submitted a written account to the Lancaster County Historical Society. Mast was 71 years old. She stated that her mother, a woman who had worked briefly at the Lancaster County Poorhouse in 1869 as a laundress, had described to her, on multiple occasions throughout her childhood and into Mast's adult years, a child in the infant ward who was unlike any child her mother had ever encountered in that work. Not deformed, not ill, not frightening in any way her mother could name clearly. Simply enormous, calm. Her mother had told her that the child did not cry the way the other children cried, that she watched people who entered the ward with a steadiness that felt wrong in an infant of that age, that the other children in the ward, children who were often distressed, often ill, often loud with the specific misery of institutional care, grew quiet when this child was near them. Her mother had worked in the infant ward for 4 months before leaving for other employment. She had thought about that child, she told her daughter, for the rest of her life. Mast's account is preserved in the Lancaster County Historical Society's manuscript collection under catalog reference MC-0441. It has never been published. It has never been cited in any academic work on Pennsylvania poorhouse history that this investigation has been able to locate. If Ware's documentation was accurate, if the second physician, H. Clement, confirmed what the scale showed, then the child found on that road weighed more than twice what any 2-year-old in the established medical literature of that period weighed. If Cornwell and Becht were telling the truth to Gerald Marsh in 1891, then she was removed by men who carried documents no one was permitted to examine and left no paperwork behind. If Edna Mast's elderly mother was not fabricating a story she had carried for 50 years without any apparent reason to invent it, then what was placed in that Lancaster ward in October of 1869 was not a child anyone in that institution knew how to record, classify, or explain. For 37 years after his original article, Gerald Marsh's name does not appear in any Lancaster newspaper index in connection with this case. He wrote about elections, about local business, about church fairs and county harvests. He never published a follow-up. The men who visited his home in April of 1891 were never identified. His burned documents were never recovered. His widow lived until 1917 and, according to her granddaughter's account, did not speak of the visitors or the documents again after the year of his death. The Lancaster County Poorhouse building was demolished in 1911. The land was purchased shortly afterward by a private real estate company incorporated in Philadelphia. That company's name does not appear in any Philadelphia city directory for the years surrounding its incorporation. The deed transfer is recorded at Lancaster County Courthouse. The buyer is identified by corporate name only. The official account tells us that the child found on the Conestoga Road in 1869 was an abandoned orphan who received care and was transferred to an institution in Philadelphia. What Ware's notes tell us is that she was not an ordinary child, by any measurement available to him. What Becht and Cornwell told Marsh tells us that her removal was conducted outside of any documented procedure. What Mast's account tells us is that someone who spent 4 months in that ward with her never stopped thinking about her. And what the pattern of missing records, reclassified ledgers, and unanswered correspondence tells us is that whatever she was, the institutions that encountered her decided very quickly and very deliberately that she should not remain in the public record. These stories survive because people refuse to stop looking. If you've made it this far, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it's buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I'm following the thread that leads from Lancaster directly to Cincinnati. Dr. Harlan Cross documented 4 children between 1872 and 1878 who match this same profile. He compiled a 200-page report and submitted it to the Ohio Medical Society in the spring of 1879. His medical license was revoked within the year. The official reason given was conduct unbecoming. The report was never published. One partial copy is known to survive. We know where it is. We know who has it. And next week, we are going to talk about what it says.